All right, we just wrapped up Doctrine of Creation. One of the things God created was human beings. When we get to heaven, we can ask him why on earth he did something so silly. Just kidding, of course. Isn't online education fun? Well, let's talk about Doctrine of Humanity. So God created human beings, and there's a whole bunch of things about human beings that are relevant for the theological conversation. There are things that set up questions of sin, and of course then about salvation. And so we're going to walk through these, some of these important questions. So the first question, just what do we mean by human beings? What are human beings? It seems obvious, but actually it's one of these questions that when you engage is actually fairly complicated. I don't think you can give a strict definition of human beings. Definition is a precise thing that clearly decides what is a human and what is not a human. And of course, if you've done any work in ethics, you realize that sometimes it can get really difficult to figure out what is a human person. And, so, but instead of a definition, I think we can give a description. A description of humans. Humans are created, eternal. We haven't always existed, but we will always exist. Sentient or self-aware, moral, and intrinsically relational beings. A couple of crucial questions about human beings, about our nature. The first one is the composition of humanity. I don't mean like composition like we have arms and legs, obviously, right? But composition in terms of soul and body. So 3 different views on this. The first view is called monism. We've seen this term before. Monism just means there's one. And on this, the composition question, for to be human is to be essentially embodied. So humans must have a body. So what we are is an embodied being, right? Now, those that hold this don't necessarily deny that there's no such thing as a resurrection. It just means that if human beings are resurrected, we will always have a body. It also means that we can't exist apart from our body. Dualism is probably the maybe view that a lot of Christians just assume. So there's a physical body, there's also a soul, right? And the idea is that a person dies, but their soul continues to exist. That's a dualistic understanding, that there's these 2 things that are together. The third view is known as trichotomism. And trichotomism is basically an extension of the dualistic idea that there's this body, there's this material thing, and there's immaterial thing. But what they do is they divide the immaterial thing into 2 different. So soul and spirit are separate things for the trichotomist. Second debate is the origin of soul. For those that believe that we have this thing called the soul, where does it come from? And also here we have 3 views. This lecture is going to be really big on 3 views. The first view is that these souls are pre-existent. That is, they pre-exist you. They existed before you were born. This view holds that they were created by God before the creation of the world. So the idea is God created as many souls that he's going to need, say 9 billion of them or 100 billion of them, I don't know, right? And then he created all these souls in the days of creation. And then as each baby is born, he takes one of those souls and puts it in, drops it into the baby. So our souls pre-exist our being born is the idea. It doesn't mean that we're aware of that time, but the souls were pre-existent. Second view is called creationism. Creationism just means they're created by God as he needed them. So you were... whenever a soul enters, let's say the soul enters the zygote, the human person, the physical part of the being at conception. So God takes that soul, creates a brand new soul, and then places it in that developing person. The third view is probably the most common these days. The view is it's called traducianism. The idea is that God created 2 souls. He created Adam's soul, he created Eve's soul. But from those persons, he gave the capacity to create other souls, to create other persons. So that doesn't mean that we literally receive, there's a gene that is our soul or something like this. But it is received from our parents. Our soul is something that is passed down. So in the act of reproduction, we not only create physical bodies, we create souls. Third big issue here is that humans are created in the image of God. This is an important doctrine. Genesis 1 talks about this idea that God created us in his own image. Okay, so what is meant by that? First thing that's really important to say is that when we talk about this, we're talking about all humans regardless of gender, race, ability, or sinfulness. So you can sin, that doesn't take away your being in the image of God. You can be disabled in one shape, way, or form. You can be terribly sick and still be in the image of God. And of course, males and females and all races, persons of all races, are created in the image of God. Now, what is it? Now, here we have three different views, three different ways of thinking about this that have been common throughout church history. The first is a substantial view, really common in the medieval time, in medieval church. Our substance, or our, what makes us persons, is what they thought. So they point to things like our rationality. God is a rational being. He gave us the ability to be rational. Or God has persons, right? 3 persons. So he gave us personhood, right? So those are the things that make up our image of God. The second view is called the relational view. The relational views are relational capacities, our capacities to enter into relationships. So that will include everything from our capacity to love, our capacity for empathy, all of these sorts of things. God is a relational being, so he gave that to us. We are also relational beings. The third one's sort of a unique one. It's a little different than the others. Both the others talk about things that we have. This one says the image of God is something that we do, right? So God calls us, our first job as humans was to be caretakers of creation. So on this view, the image of God is that we are to image God or represent God to creation. So we are to be God's caretakers of creation. All right, so here's the big debate with doctrine of humanity, and it's a difficult one. It's frankly, it's one that sometimes people just don't want to talk about because people get sort of crabby about it. It's actually a pretty contentious question in the contemporary world, and that is: are human beings created with a gendered hierarchy? So this is are men supposed to be in charge? Is the question. And first thing to see here is that there's actually 2 issues where this or 2 contexts maybe where this plays out. The first one, of course, is in the marriage context, right? Are there marriage roles where the husband needs to be in charge of the wife? So is there a hierarchical assumption for marriage in a Christian understanding? And the second one, sort of obviously, is ministry roles. Can women be in spiritual authority over men? Can a woman be a senior pastor? Can a woman teach men? These are all related into this. So 2 applications of the question. Are humans created the gendered hierarchy, both marriage and ministry? All right, and what I'm going to give you is I'm going to try to lay out 3 different views on this. Some people make it, just kind of simplify it down to 2 views. I actually think it's important to draw out the difference between the second. There's this third view that I think is important to distinguish. The first view is called complementarianism. This has been probably the dominant view throughout church history, although it's never been the only view. There have always been another side to this, but this probably has been the dominant view throughout church history. Complementarian view is so called because the assumption is that males and females have been given complementary roles, not equal roles, but complementary. So imagine on a football team, not everybody gets to be the quarterback. The quarterback is kind of in charge of things. You need to have other players as well that have a complementary role, and so the whole team can function well. And in this, the complementarian emphasizes that God has ordained male leadership. So males are to be in charge in both ministry, and in marriage, right? So that doesn't mean that women are unimportant, or because again, there's complementary roles. Doesn't mean they're not loved by God. Doesn't mean they're not fully human. Doesn't mean anything like that. Actually, it doesn't even mean that women can't be in leadership. They just can't be in leadership over men, is what the complementarian view says. Why would you believe this? There's a couple of passages. There's a 1 Corinthians 11 passage, but the one that's probably most commonly pointed to is the 1 Timothy 2 passage. And women should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. So this passage and other passages, and the fact that complementarians say throughout church history, it's been men that's been in charge. That's why complementarians hold their position, why the evidence they use for that position. Second view is known as egalitarianism. Egalitarianism is you get from the idea a little bit more of an equal position, and so the assertion is that males and females can have identical roles. Doesn't mean they have to have identical roles. So you could have a male being in leadership, but you could have a female being in leadership. How would you decide who should be in leadership? Who is the gifts? So if you're an egalitarian, you're not saying we don't want any men in leadership. What you say is you want men in leadership that have the gifts to be in leadership. But if a woman is more gifted, you put her in leadership. So this would be in the case in both marriage and in ministry. So I would say my wife and I have an egalitarian marriage. That is, we both focus on things that we take the lead on different things that we're better at. So there's some things that I do a little better. I take the lead on that. There's some things my wife does better at, and she takes the lead on that. And of course, that's a complicated thing that you have to work out in all sorts of ways. Now, why would you hold this view? Biblical reasons. There's quite a few women that are listed in the New Testament as being teachers and as being leaders in the early church. So just in Romans 16, you have Priscilla, Phoebe, and Junia listed as teachers. In fact, Junia is listed as an apostle. Add to this the fact that the first teachers of the gospel were women. When Jesus was resurrected, the gospel is all about the resurrection. It was the women that were the first witnesses to that. And the women went and gave that message to the male disciples. So New Testament lists examples of women as being teachers. And then egalitarians look at the 1 Timothy 2 passage and say, what you have here is a very unique situation. So it's not something that's supposed to be a transcultural message. It's something that's supposed to be just dealing with that situation. In Ephesus, Timothy was in Ephesus, and so Paul was writing to Timothy when he was in the Ephesian church. You had a very unique situation where you had a kind of female cult. That was the religious context. And women were used to being in charge in religious situations. But if women didn't have education and weren't able to learn, as they weren't at that time, Paul says, no, if you haven't actually studied, if you haven't learned, if you haven't learned these things, you need to be quiet. But that doesn't mean that in our context that women should be silent, because in our context, women have every opportunity to be educated as men do. The final view here is feminism. You could call this, feminism is an egalitarian view, but it extends that a little bit. It's not, it asserts the egalitarian position, but then it pushes a little farther in the critique of patriarchy and complementarianism. So one of the ways it extends this is that there's an argument that male and females are identical. I don't mean identical in plumbing. Everybody knows there's differences there, right? But males and females are identical in terms of abilities. And the differences that we have, like sometimes it's traditionally said men are more assertive, and women are more gentle or something like that. Feminists point out, no, that's because men are raised to be more assertive and women are raised to be more gentle or deferring or something like that. So the differences between males and females are due to socialization, is the feminist claim. The second thing is feminist raises, I think, a very interesting question: is why are we all excited in the church about who gets to be in charge? Isn't this whole idea itself a concept that isn't entirely ideal? So feminists critique the whole entire idea of leadership as being a patriarchal construct. That's something maybe we should want to distance ourselves from. And instead of asking who's the one person gets to be in charge, what about team leadership? Now, I think that's a really interesting point. I think that team leadership can be really effective. Now, I'm not sure I want to throw out leadership completely because God is going to be the leader of the church still, obviously. But I think in terms of humans, I think some of this, who's going to be in charge, does probably lead to a problematic sort of thing. So that I think there's an interesting point being made there. And the last thing, the cultural gender differences that we have, the feminist argues, these are just unimportant, right? And they point to Galatians 3. In Christ, there's no male and female. So the various, things that your culture says that males should be like and the females should be like, those are things that we as Christians should try to see past, right? It's not that, it's understandable that we might have these beliefs or assumptions, but we need to try to work past these things. So really important question, how, males and females and how that works. 3 different views, all can point to scripture and have interesting arguments. And it's left to you to decide how to think about this. I certainly tend to be egalitarian, and I think there's aspects of the feminist critique that are interesting and probably need to be taken seriously. All right, there you go.